In this first episode, we are discussing the book Tea Baa by Literary Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison. Set on an island in the French Caribbean, Tea Baa is the story of Sun, an African-American who jumps ship and ends up on Valerian's property, a white American industrial. The black man's presence is troubling for all inhabitants, especially for Jadine, Valerian's house help's niece. Both her and Sun end up in a toxic relationship where class and colorism become an issue. For this episode, I've invited Ghanaian spoken word artist and activist Poetra Asantewa to discuss the book because of her love for words and her feminist politics. We are meeting at Tea Baa, a cozy coffee shop with a new soul Afropolitan vibe. So Poetra, what was your first impression when you read the book?
I think the very first impression was the language in which Toni Morrison wrote.
Okay.
And I always think that writers are, well, even if they're writing in English or whichever language that they're writing in, it's just that they take a whole new form. And Toni Morrison has this language. It's English, but it's still as if it's her own English, her own language, her own language that she's bringing to the story. And I think that's something that I took from her. She has this flavor, she has this way of describing things. Like there are certain phrases which are peculiar to her. She says, where he yanked the tongue from the roof of his mouth. And it's just delicious, the way in which her language is. And so that was the very first thing I noticed about Toni Morrison. And in all her books, you notice that that's what she does.
And one of the topics I actually wanted to hear you on is the idea of toxic relationships and in different ways. So if we start with romantic toxic relationships, right? I felt that the two couples that are kind of interesting to think of, Valerian and Margaret, so the two white people, owners of the place, right? And how Valerian is very abusive to Margaret in terms of like verbally abusing her, constantly belittling her. I guess it plays with very narrow egos and kind of hurt masculinities, where in order to feel good, you always have to put down your belittle her or insult her to make you feel good. And then in the story, you get it that he actually went with her because of her beauty, right? She was a beauty queen, etc. In reading this, like in kind of getting into both characters, I really had the feeling that it was something that you find often in couples. So is that something that you also think is something that we can kind of generalize to society?
I think we can definitely emphasize. When it comes to generalization, it would be hard, but it's definitely a huge point. And the book executed it well. And even with a toxic relationship, you realize there's an underlying factor. There's this gender, like you said, masculinity. There's gender because, Valerian, by virtue of Margaret being woman, or by virtue of the marriage happening because of her beauty, he did not regard her opinions because he thought, well, I have more experience than you, I have more knowledge than you, you are ignorant in certain things, you don't know this, you don't know this, and that's because one, you're younger, and two, I come from a richer family, so definitely I've had this experience, and three, you are a woman, you definitely haven't had the kind of exposure, or you will never have the kind of strength or the kind of exposure that I have had. There are definitely patterns that exist. It can't be denied. The relationship between verbal abuse in romantic relationships stems from gender. One, classism, ageism in Ghana, very, 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 like, as a woman, you have to have some kind of respect in conversation, even when you're right. You have to act like, you have to, like, be respectful, even with your opinions, no matter how right you are. And so that definitely exists in my society. And even between on the topic of toxic relationships between Jadine and Son.
Yeah.
Even though between the two of them, Jadine was the more educated, the breadwinner of the relationship, the more exposed, etc. Son still thought that it mattered more that he knew his roots. It mattered more that he knew who he was. And he felt that that definition of who he was the final thing, was the all-encompassing definition of somebody who is rooted in who they are.
And actually when they meet, they just hate each other. And it's as if everything you are, I hate it because it's kind of a mirror towards what I maybe want to be, or maybe what I should be. You know, like Son showing back what blackness means to Jadine, and Jadine reflecting on Son what education would mean. You know, this kind of mirror play. You know?
I think between the two people, Jadine and Son, and I think this reflects a lot in relationships in our community. You know, it's like they see both parties, both Jadine and Son, saw things in which they strongly disliked, but there were also things that they loved. And so it felt like it read like they were attracted to each other, but there was the agenda, there was a later agenda that I will make you into who I want you to be.
Yeah.
And that's how relationships play out. Like, there's something I love about you, there's something I hate about you. But because I love something about you, I'm going to make this work, but the end game is to get you to be molded into who I want you to be.
Yeah.
You know, there's a part where one person said, why are you trying to change me? And the other person said, why are you trying to change me? And they both recognized that they were each trying to change each other. And I wish they had, at that very moment, you know, the text could have been explored to make accommodation for the fact that can we both be who we are, but, you know, create something that takes from you and takes from me? Can that exist? Do we have to completely change our identities to exist? If we do, then that's too violent, and that means that cannot exist, which is what I think the novel did eventually say, that the fact that they both wanted to change each other drastically was violent, and so they went separate ways. But I would have loved to make way for an idea that we remain who we are, but we create something that combines the two.
And you were just saying that there are things that they actually loved in one and another. And what I was actually thinking, okay, what is it that they love, right? And I was like, okay, why did Son actually go? Like, what is the kind of discourse Son has on Jadine? And he only talks about her beauty.
I think one other thing I noticed was for Son, he felt Jadine was untainted. And he, coming from like a rough background, from like a pure black background, he had seen the roughness of the world, and there was something soft about her nature that paired up with his could be the perfect thing. And I think that's sort of the reverse of how she felt. She, you know, the very first instance, it was very put off with who he was, but once he had cleaned up, he was like, okay, I love your rough edges, and together we can make something work. So I think it was polar opposites that somehow attracted each of them to,
And moving to Black womanhood, and that's the character Jadine, who is kind of interesting. So, in talking with you, you think she's mixed, right?
Yes, I think Jadine. I was actually looking for Yala, like I was looking for it online if there were other, but yes, I think that the politics of who Jadine is in the book was very heavy and very conflicted in the book, because I felt like Jadine was trying to prove herself throughout the book.
Okay.
And she had to prove herself against so many things, against one being a woman. She wanted to just exist as a woman. And for her, sometimes she wanted, I just want to be a woman. I don't want to be a black woman. Or I don't want to be a black woman who is orphaned and raised by her aunties. And I don't want to be a black woman who's orphaned and whose education has been sponsored by a white older man. A black woman who is in love with a black man who feels like his blackness is the definition of what black should be. Like, you know, there are different analogies and identities that one way or the other she belongs to just by existing. And she wanted to exist free of all of these things, which I think is complicated. I think it's a hard thing to ask.
Yeah.
But it's still valid.
Okay.
It's still very valid. I think that it's a hard thing to ask, but it's valid. We don't live in a vacuum as a person. You know, even if you're stripping away the fact that she was black, you can't strip away the fact that she belonged to a family, and so she had certain obligations towards that family. And it's just hard to say fuck everything and, you know, just be me. It's just hard as an individual generally to say that this is who I want to be at any given point in time.
So that actually comes into this idea of the individual versus a community. And I get what you're saying, that you cannot totally escape from it. But at some point, isn't it also community that kind of pushes you out? You know? Like, if you want to belong, these are the rules.
And I think that community should make way, should make space for the individual to exist as an individual, even if it's for a period of time. That should happen even for our own mental health. The community is still a community, whether they are displeased or not. They still remain a community, and I think that should be the relationship between community and individuals. Like, no matter how far you go, you can always bounce back. And it's not always easy, but I think that space should exist.
I still have the feeling that society, like, if we could use sun as a metaphor for society, it kind of embraces that idea that it's one place, one identity.
One identity. Heavy book.
Heavy. And there's much more to say, I guess.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This conversation is a needed one.